car is this? Step out. Now.
Officer, I wrote the textbook you studied at the academy. Check my...
Enough games. Hands behind your back, Barsh. You're under arrest.
The body cam captured everything. Every slur, every assumption, every second of what was about to become the most expensive mistake in department history. Officer Miller didn't know the woman he was handcuffing had literally written the arrest procedures manual. He'd failed. He didn't know his racism would cost him his badge, his pension in the city, $1.5 million. Quick question. If you saw this happening to your neighbor, would you pull out your phone or walk away? Comment below and hit subscribe, because what happens next will restore your faith that karma is real. Your Evelyn Harper wasn't just another elderly woman caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. At 62 years old, she had dedicated 35 years of her life to teaching constitutional law, rising through the ranks to become dean of one of the state's most prestigious law schools. Her career was the kind that most legal professionals could only dream of achieving. She had authored the definitive textbook on constitutional arrest procedures, a 700-page tome that sat on the desks of police academy instructors across the country. The irony was almost poetic. The book that Officer Jake Miller had studied, the one he'd been tested on before receiving his badge, had been written by the woman he was now treating like a common criminal. Over 3.5 decades, Dr. Harper had shaped the minds of thousands of law students who went on to become prosecutors, defense attorneys, civil rights advocates, and even federal judges. Her lectures on the Fourth Amendment were legendary. Her understanding of police procedure so thorough that departments regularly consulted her when developing new training protocols. She had testified before state legislatures on criminal justice reform, served on advisory boards for police oversight committees, and received numerous awards for her contributions to legal education. Her office walls were covered with commendations, photographs with governors and Supreme Court justices, and letters of gratitude from former students who credited her with inspiring their careers. But none of that mattered to Officer Jake Miller. At 28 years old, with barely 2 years on the force, he saw only what his prejudices allowed him to see: an elderly black woman driving a car he assumed she couldn't possibly afford. His training, including the chapters Dr. Harper herself had written about implicit bias and constitutional rights during traffic stops, had apparently made no impression. To him, she was just another suspicious character, someone whose mere presence in an expensive vehicle demanded explanation and skepticism. The Cadillac Eldorado had been Dr. Harper's gift to herself, purchased 6 months earlier to commemorate 35 years in legal education. She had always admired classic cars, and when she spotted the fully restored 1959 convertible at an estate sale, she knew it was meant to be hers. The car wasn't just a vehicle. It was a symbol of how far she'd come from the working-class neighborhood where she'd grown up, where dreams of becoming a law school dean seemed impossibly distant. That Sunday afternoon had started like any other peaceful weekend. Dr. Harper had spent the morning grading papers and reviewing faculty evaluations, then decided she deserved a break. The weather was perfect, the kind of crisp autumn day that made you want to feel the wind in your hair. She had taken the scenic route along Lakeshore Drive, the radio tuned to a smooth jazz station, Miles Davis's trumpet floating through the air as the sun cast long shadows across the water. The tree-lined road was nearly empty, just a few cyclists and joggers enjoying the beautiful afternoon. She noticed the patrol car in her rearview mirror about a mile from her turnoff. It maintained a steady distance behind her, neither accelerating nor dropping back. Dr. Harper checked her speedometer, confirming she was driving exactly at the posted limit. Her registration was current, her inspection sticker valid. There was no reason for concern, she told herself. Police presence in this area was common, just routine patrols ensuring public safety. Then the lights came on. Red and blue flashed in her mirror, and the brief whoop of the siren cut through her music. Dr. Harper's heart sank slightly, but she remained calm. She'd been pulled over perhaps twice in her entire life, both times for minor infractions, that had been quickly resolved. She carefully signaled and guided the Cadillac onto the shoulder, turning off the engine and placing her hands visibly on the steering wheel. The jazz went silent, replaced by the sound of wind rustling through nearby trees and the distant hum of traffic. She took a deep breath, assuming this would be a quick check of her paperwork, maybe a question about whether she'd seen anything unusual in the area. She had no idea that the next 30 minutes would fundamentally change her understanding of the gap between the law as written and the law as experienced by people who look like her. Officer Miller's boots crunched on the gravel as he approached the driver's side, his hand resting on his holstered weapon in a way that immediately set Dr. Harper on edge. His body language was aggressive, suspicious, nothing like the professional courtesy she'd expected. When he demanded to know whose car she was driving, his tone carried an accusation before she'd even had a chance to speak. Dr. Harper reached slowly for the glove compartment, narrating her movements as she retrieved the registration. "This is my vehicle, officer. Here's the registration showing my name and address." Her voice remained steady, professional, the same tone she used when addressing hostile witnesses during her days as a trial attorney. Miller barely glanced at the document. "What do you do for a living?" he asked, his skepticism evident in every syllable. The question itself revealed his assumption that someone like her couldn't legitimately own something like this. Dr. Harper explained her position calmly and clearly. She was the dean of the state law school, a tenured professor with over 3 decades of experience. She even mentioned hoping it might establish common ground that she'd written textbooks used in law enforcement training. Miller's response was a laugh, harsh and dismissive. "Sure you are, and I'm the governor. Stop playing games with me, lady. Get out of the car, now!" The situation was escalating in exactly the way Judge Harper had warned about in Chapter 7 of her textbook, the section titled De-Escalation Techniques and Constitutional Boundaries. She could practically recite the page numbers. But knowing the theory and experiencing the reality were two entirely different things. She complied, stepping out slowly with her hands raised and visible, demonstrating perfect cooperation. Miller grabbed her wrists, yanking it behind her back with unnecessary force. The metal handcuffs clicked shut, the sound sharp and final in the quiet afternoon air. Dr. Harper's faculty ID card, her driver's license, and her wallet tumbled from her hands onto the gravel, their contents spilling out credit cards in her name, her law school business card identifying her as dean, a photograph of her receiving an award from the State Bar Association. Miller didn't look down. He was too focused on controlling what he perceived as a threat, too committed to his initial judgment, to reconsider the evidence literally at his feet. From the nearby walking path, a young couple had stopped to watch. The woman, recognizing something was wrong, pulled out her phone and began recording. Her boyfriend whispered urgently, "That's Dr. Harper. She taught my sister. What the hell is happening?" The back seat of the patrol car was cramped and humiliating, designed for criminals, not for a woman who had spent decades teaching others about dignity and constitutional rights. Dr. Harper sat with her shoulders pressed against the hard plastic divider, her wrists aching where the handcuffs bit into her skin. Red marks were already forming the metal cutting into flesh that had never known such treatment. She could feel her pulse throbbing against the restraints, each beat a reminder of her powerlessness in this moment. The woman who commanded lecture halls and presided over faculty meetings now sat trapped in a cage meant for suspects and lawbreakers. Through the smudged window, she could see her beautiful Cadillac sitting abandoned on the shoulder, its red paint gleaming mockingly in the afternoon sun. Her purse lay on the ground where it had fallen, its contents scattered across the gravel like evidence at a crime scene. Her faculty ID card, with its official university seal, was face up in the dirt, clearly visible to anyone who bothered to look. But Officer Miller hadn't looked. He was too busy radioing in his supposed triumph. Miller's voice crackled through the radio, self-satisfied and confident. "Dispatch, this is Unit 12. I've got a suspect in custody for possible vehicle theft. Black female, early 60s, claims to be some kind of professor or dean." "Yeah, I know. She's got the whole act down, probably been running this scam for years. Vehicle is a red 1959 Cadillac Eldorado worth at least 60 grand. She couldn't produce adequate proof of ownership, became evasive when questioned. I've detained her pending verification. Dr. Harper closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe slowly and evenly. Her legal mind was already cataloging the violations: unlawful detention without probable cause, failure to verify information before arrest, use of excessive force during a non-threatening encounter. She was mentally drafting the lawsuit even as she sat there, though the professional analysis did nothing to ease the burning humiliation of the moment. The young couple who had been watching hurried closer, their faces twisted with confusion and anger. The woman, still recording on her phone, called out loudly enough for the camera to pick up her words. "Officer, that's Dr. Evelyn Harper. She's the dean of the state law school. Boyfriend and I both took her constitutional law class. You've made a huge mistake." Miller spun around his hand, moving instinctively toward his belt. "Step back, both of you. This is police business. You're interfering with an active investigation." The boyfriend stepped forward, his voice urgent and pleading. "Sir, I'm telling you, that's Dean Harper. She's been teaching at the university for decades. Check her ID, check her wallet. It's all right there on the ground. You can call the law school and verify. This is wrong." Miller's face flushed dark red anger, replacing the confidence from moments before. Something in the couple's certainty was rattling him, but he'd committed too far to back down now. "I said step back. Both of you get away from this scene right now, or I will arrest you both for obstruction of justice. I don't care if you think you know this woman. Move, now." The girlfriend continued, recording, her phone trembling slightly, but the lens staying focused on the patrol car where Dr. Harper sat, visible through the rear window. "We're on a public sidewalk, officer. We have every right to be here. And we're witnessing what looks like a wrongful arrest of a respected member of our community." Miller grabbed his radio again, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Dispatch, I need backup at Lakeshore Drive, mile marker 7. I've got 2 civilians interfering with an arrest, refusing to comply with lawful orders. Send at least 2 units." Within minutes, the peaceful Sunday afternoon dissolved into chaos. 2 more patrol cars arrived, their sirens wailing and lights flashing, turning what should have been a routine traffic stop into a spectacle that drew attention from everyone within a half-mile radius. Joggers stopped mid-stride. Cyclists pulled over to watch. Residents from nearby homes wandered out to their porches, craning their necks to see what warranted such a massive police response. 3 patrol cars now blocked the shoulder, their red and blue lights painting the trees and pavement in alternating colors. The effect was disorienting, nightmarish. Dr. Harper watched through the window as more officers arrived, each one adding to the circus atmosphere. This wasn't law enforcement. This was theater, a performance of power for an audience that shouldn't exist. And she was the unwilling star displayed in the back of a patrol car like a criminal on parade. The young woman's phone captured it all, the vertical frame shaking slightly as she tried to keep the scene in view while maintaining a safe distance. Her boyfriend had pulled out his phone too, creating a second angle, a second witness to what was unfolding. In the age of viral videos and social media, Justice Officer Miller had just created the kind of documentation that would haunt him for the rest of his career. One of the newly arrived officers, a woman with sergeant stripes on her sleeve, approached Miller with an expression that mixed confusion and concern. "What have we got here?" Miller dispatch said, something about a vehicle theft and civilian interference. Miller launched into his explanation, each word digging his hole deeper. Elderly black female driving a $60,000 classic car couldn't adequately explain ownership, became evasive and uncooperative. Claims to be some law school dean, but you know how these things go. The car's probably stolen and she's got a whole identity worked out. Sergeant Patricia Davis had been on the force for 17 years, long enough to recognize when something didn't smell right. She walked past Miller toward the patrol car, her eyes narrowing as she studied the woman sitting in the back seat. There was something about the way the woman sat, the dignity in her posture despite the handcuffs, the intelligence evident in her eyes even through the dirty window. This didn't look like a car thief. This looked like someone who was used to being in control, someone who commanded respect in rooms much larger than the back of a police cruiser. Davis moved closer, peering through the window, and her heart stopped. Wait a minute, hold on. Her voice rose with urgency and dawning horror. Dean Harper, is that Dean Harper? Dr. Harper met the sergeant's eyes and nodded once, a small movement that carried the weight of confirmation and accusation. Sergeant Davis's face went pale. She spun toward Miller, her voice sharp enough to cut steel. Please tell me you checked her identification before putting her in handcuffs. Miller's confidence wavered for the first time. She claimed to be someone important, but they all say that. I was following protocol for suspicious activity. Davis was already moving, grabbing her radio with hands that shook slightly. Dispatch, this is Sergeant Davis. I need an immediate verification on a name. Evelyn Harper, Evelynharper. I need to know if she's associated with the state law school. The silence that followed stretched out like taffy, each second feeling like an hour. The radio static filled the air, a harsh electronic hiss that seemed to mock the tension of the moment. Dr. Harper watched through the window as realization began to dawn on Miller's face. The other officers stood frozen, sensing that something had gone catastrophically wrong, but not yet understanding the full scope of the disaster. Then the radio crackled to life, and the dispatcher's voice cut through the afternoon like a judge's gavel. Sergeant Davis, that's a confirmed match. Dr. Evelyn Harper is the current dean of the state law school. She's also listed in our VIP contact database. Code Red, repeat, Code Red. She's a high-profile community leader with direct lines to the mayor's office and the police commissioner. What's the situation there? The color drained from Miller's face like water down a drain, the red flush of anger replaced by a sickly white pallor that made him look like he might faint. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his brain trying to process what his ears had just heard. Around him, the other officers stepped back, almost unconsciously, as if the contamination of his colossal mistake might somehow be contagious. Sergeant Davis closed her eyes briefly, exhaling a long, slow breath that spoke of frustration, disappointment, and the certain knowledge that the next few hours were going to be an absolute nightmare of paperwork, explanations, and damage control. Sergeant Davis moved quickly to the patrol car, her keys already in hand. The metallic click of the door unlocking seemed unnaturally loud in the sudden stillness that had fallen over the scene. Harper remained motionless in the back seat, her posture unchanged, watching through the window as the sergeant approached with an expression that mixed professional concern and personal mortification. The handcuffs came off with two distinct clicks, the sound of metal releasing metal. Dr. Harper brought her hands forward, slowly rotating her wrists in small circles. The skin where the cuffs had been was angry, and red deep grooves pressed into her flesh from nearly 20 minutes of confinement. The marks stood out starkly against her brown skin, a physical record of indignity that would take hours to fade. She rubbed at the impressions gently, her face betraying no emotion, even as the blood flow returning to her hands must have brought pins and needles of discomfort. She adjusted her gold-rimmed glasses, which had been knocked slightly askew during the arrest, and smoothed down her blouse with the careful precision of someone reasserting control over their appearance and their circumstances. Every movement was deliberate, measured the actions of someone who understood that dignity once lost must be consciously reclaimed. Officer Miller stood frozen several feet away, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. His face had gone from white to a splotchy red as the full weight of what he'd done began to register. He shifted his weight from foot to foot like a schoolboy called before the principal, his hands fidgeting with his belt. Sergeant Davis shot him a look that could have stripped paint then stepped aside to allow Dr. Harper to exit the vehicle. Harper emerged from the patrol car with the same grace she brought to the lecture hall, though her legs were stiff from the cramped position and her shoulders ached from having her arms restrained behind her back. She stood to her full height, which wasn't particularly tall, but in that moment she seemed to tower over everyone present. The other officers who had responded to Miller's backup call stood at a distance, suddenly very interested in their radios and notebooks, none of them wanting to be associated with what was clearly about to become a departmental disaster. Miller took a tentative step forward, his voice cracking slightly as he attempted to salvage the unsalvageable. Dr. Harper, look, this was just a misunderstanding, a simple mistake. These things happen in police work. If you could just, let this go, we can all move on. No harm done, right? The young couple who had witnessed everything still stood nearby, their phones, still recording, capturing every word. The girlfriend's hand had stopped shaking now. She held her device steady, instinctively understanding that she was documenting something important, something that would matter. Dr. Harper turned to face Miller fully for the first time since being released. She met his eyes with a pose so cold and analytical it could have been used in an operating room. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, controlled, but it carried across the scene with the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention in courtrooms and classrooms. Officer Miller, I have taught constitutional law for 35 years. In that time, I have written 3 textbooks on criminal procedure, including the one you studied at the police academy. The book with the blue cover titled Constitutional Arrest Procedures. Perhaps you remember it. Perhaps you even passed the exam on it. She paused, letting the words sink in like acid eating through metal. In the last 20 minutes, you have violated at least 7 separate protocols that I specifically outlined in Chapter 4, Section 2 of that textbook. You conducted a traffic stop without reasonable suspicion. You escalated a peaceful encounter through aggressive questioning rooted in racial bias. You failed to examine readily available identification before making an arrest. You used excessive force on a compliant subject. You detained someone without probable cause. You ignored witness testimony that contradicted your assumptions. And you threatened to arrest citizens who were exercising their First Amendment right to observe and document police activity. Miller's face had gone white again. Around him, the other officers were backing away further, nobody wanting to be standing next to him when this bomb finished detonating. Doctor. Harper continued, her voice never rising, never losing its precise prosecutorial tone. This was not a simple misunderstanding, officer. This was a textbook case, quite literally, of racial profiling and abuse of power. And while you may think no harm was done, I can assure you that the harm is substantial and documented. The body cam footage, the dash camera footage, the civilian recordings, and the physical evidence on my wrists will all tell the same story. She picked up her purse from the ground where it had fallen, brushing gravel off the leather. Her faculty ID card, her driver's license, her business cards, and all of it went back into her bag with methodical precision. She gathered the scattered contents of her wallet, taking her time, making everyone wait, asserting control through the simple act of refusing to be rushed. I will be contacting my attorney tomorrow morning, she said, straightening up and walking toward her Cadillac. I suggest you do the same. I'll see you in federal court, Officer Miller. She slid behind the wheel of the red convertible, the leather seat familiar and comforting after the hard plastic of the patrol car. Her hands, despite the pain in her wrists, settled onto the steering wheel with the confidence of ownership that Miller had denied. The engine turned over with a smooth, powerful rumble, 64 years old and still running perfectly. As she pulled away from the shoulder and back onto Lakeshore Drive, she glanced once in the rearview mirror. Officer Miller stood exactly where she'd left him, frozen in place like a statue commemorating bad judgment. The red and blue lights still flashed across his pale face, turning him into a rotating portrait of a career ending in real time. 18 months later, the conference room on the 43rd floor of the Reynolds and Associates law firm building was filled with documents. Discovery materials were stacked in neat piles across the mahogany table. Personnel files, training records, complaint histories, and page after page of statistical analysis. Dr. Harper sat at the head of the table reading, glasses perched on her nose, reviewing depositions with the focused attention she'd once given to thesis defenses and oral arguments. Her attorney, Marcus Reynolds, a former student of hers who had gone on to build one of the most successful civil rights law practices in the state, spread out Officer Miller's personnel file like a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury. 9 complaints in 2 years, he said, tapping the folder. 9 separate incidents of alleged racial profiling or excessive force, all involving black motorists, all dismissed with minimal investigation or resulted in nothing more than additional training requirements that clearly didn't work. The department's internal affairs records painted a picture of systematic failure. Miller wasn't an isolated bad apple. He was a symptom of a department that had consistently failed to address obvious patterns of discriminatory behavior. His supervisors had seen the complaints, seen the statistics, and done nothing meaningful to intervene. In another office across town, Police Chief Robert Morrison sat in front of his computer screen, watching the dashboard camera footage for the 10th time. Each viewing made it worse. The casual racism in Miller's voice, the immediate assumption of criminality, the refusal to look at the identification literally lying on the ground, the threats directed at witnesses. Morrison put his head in his hands, knowing that this footage would be played in courtrooms, shown on news broadcasts, and used in police academy training sessions as an example of everything an officer should never do. The decision to terminate Miller's employment came swiftly. The evidence was overwhelming, the liability exposure catastrophic. Miller was called into the chief's office on a Wednesday morning and handed a termination letter along with notification that the State Police Oversight Board was reviewing his certification. By that afternoon, he was cleaning out his locker while his former colleagues avoided making eye contact. The hearing before the State Certification Board took less than 3 hours. The panel reviewed the footage, read the complaints, examined the statistical evidence of discriminatory enforcement patterns, and unanimously voted to revoke Miller's law enforcement certification permanently. He would never work as a police officer again, not in this state or any other that recognized the board's authority. The federal civil rights lawsuit went to trial on a cold morning in November. The courtroom was packed with law students, journalists, and civil rights advocates who understood they were watching something significant. Harper sat at the plaintiff's table with the same composed dignity she'd shown throughout the entire ordeal, while Miller sat slumped at the defense table looking like he'd aged 10 years and 18 months. The trial lasted 5 days. The jury deliberated for just over 3 hours. When they returned, the forewoman stood and read the verdict in a clear, firm voice that echoed through the packed courtroom. The jury found that Officer Miller and the police department had violated Dr. Harper's Fourth Amendment rights through unlawful seizure and her 14th Amendment rights through discriminatory enforcement. Compensatory damages, $500, $1,000. Punitive damages, $1,000, $1,000. Total award, $500, $1,000. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that sounded like justice finally belatedly arriving at its destination. Dr. Harper didn't keep the settlement money for herself. Within 3 months of receiving the funds, she established the Harper Civil Rights Legal Defense Fund, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing free legal representation to victims of racial profiling and police misconduct who lack the resources, education, or platform to fight back on their own. The fund's mission statement, written in her precise legal language, began with a simple truth: justice should not require a law degree to obtain. Officer Jake Miller lost everything. His badge, his pension, his career, and his reputation were all gone. He moved to another state working security jobs that lasted only until someone recognized his name and connected it to the viral videos that still circulated online, constant reminders of his spectacular failure in judgment. Daughter Harper, meanwhile, returned to her lecture hall and continued teaching constitutional law to the next generation of attorneys, prosecutors, and judges. Her case became a permanent fixture in her curriculum, a real-world example of the principles she'd spent decades teaching. But she always ended those lectures with the same haunting question. I had the education, the platform, the resources, and the credentials to fight back. But what about the grandmother who doesn't have a law degree? What about the father driving home from his shift who can't afford an attorney? What happens when the system fails? Someone without power. The question hung in the air, unanswered and uncomfortable, exactly as she intended. Have you witnessed discrimination that made you wonder if the victim would get justice? Share your story in the comments below. Understanding these situations helps us all learn how to protect our rights and stand up for others when the system fails them.